Julius Rosenwald's children traveled with him to the South. They had visited schools. They knew, in a very immediate kind of way, the kind of person he was and the kind of generosity he extended to others. And so it's not surprising to see his children picking up this legacy and serving their communities in a variety of ways. William, of course, was on the board of Tuskegee for 25 years.
His daughter Edith ends up in the South. She sees her father's heritage and carries it on by working more to advance African American education.
My grandmother, Edith Stern, was a fighter for human rights and civil rights, and she remained that way until the day she died. It's a legacy that she carried through from her father, my great-grandfather, Julius Rosenwald.
He felt that there was no higher calling in which you could engage than to combat racial prejudice.
I think perhaps the most remarkable thing that they did was in the 1930s.
Every summer, the family would go to Germany, and they would visit their German relatives. My father understood very, very well what it meant when Hitler came to power. Marion and Bill, my aunt and my father, took on the responsibility of bringing all the German relatives out from Germany. They actually ended up saving 300 members of the family. My grandfather was so good that every year he could visit Germany for 2 months. Now you realize they're going the boat, right? They're taking the boat over, which is probably 10 days, and they're going over for 2 months. Do you think that there's like no fax? No, not much phone, no, not in those days. And not in 1910, there was probably some. Telegrams were probably common. And he left it to his managers for the summer. And he had people he trusted. Well, the same applied to his philanthropy. He built a foundation called the Rosenwald Fund, and he had very good managers. He worked, I think one of them came from the Rockefeller Fund, Edward Embry, brilliant man. But my grandfather had a big heart, and when people came to him to tell him a problem, he would listen, but he would have an idea. So people came to him, he met Booker T. Washington, and Booker T. Washington wanted him to give money to the university, and my grandfather did, as you will see in the film. But then Booker T. Washington said, could you take some, he gave a second gift, my grandfather did. He said, could you take, Booker T. Washington said, could you take some of that money and apply it to some schools in the area, because the children really have no education. And it is hard for us to understand now, that maybe you understand it, that there was almost nothing for Black children. There were some efforts, and the states didn't, in the South didn't care. And there was obviously segregation, but it was not equal at all. But there were actually no schools. And so my grandfather said yes, and then he went down and visited them, and it changed his life. And really, he died rather young. I mean, he died at 70 in 1932, the bottom of the Depression, but the foundation continued. Now, it was unusual because this foundation was a sunset foundation. It was supposed to stop after 25 years after his death. But the people in the foundation continued his efforts, and they built 5,000 schools, or some of them were buildings for teachers and so forth, but most of it was schools, and a few hundred of them still survive. My guess is that they weren't very popular in the South, but that's all right. And I've met people who went to those schools and talked about how they walked for miles barefoot to go to the school, and they would have bone soup for lunch. The teacher would bring a bone, and all the children, each of the children would bring a something, a can, a something, and they'd pour it in, and that was how they had bone soup every day for lunch. But he was able to go and visit his cousins who were still in Germany, because his father had actually come from Germany. And my father, the youngest of the 5 children, little Billy, he got his own feeling. He was very sensitive. And I think his desire to help people came partly from how misbegotten he felt, being a little lost as the youngest of these family, because by the time my grandfather had become wealthy, they were so busy, he and his wife, my grandfather and his wife, that my father thought that the children's hour was about how children could see their mother for an hour a day while she was getting dressed. So he really was very sad. So he spent his life, carried on the mission, except not with blacks, but the big emergency when my father came into his own was, of course, Hitler. And he dedicated himself, but he knew what it meant, because I asked him that, and he says, why did you know? And he said, well, I visited the family and I knew what the implications were. It wasn't some abstract out there thing far away. Then I said to him, well, but I don't understand. Nobody else knew what was going on. And he said, well, could you tell me how you really knew? And he said, well, oh, that's easy. It was in all the papers, my father said, which I don't think it was, because everybody would have known then. But he dedicated his life, and people said he loved refugees so much that he even married one, my mother, from Russia and Germany. But the family got together and not only brought people over, but had to give affidavits and see to their welfare, and that got them jobs and housing and so forth. The 300 they rescued is not comparable to the great work of Susan Mendes, who rescued 10 times that much in his brilliant work. But it was meaningful and hard. And I would like to say that the continued work he did developed in part into the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. How many of you heard of the Joint? Has anybody heard of the Joint? Yeah, and I still am on the board of it, and it's still doing the great work. Believe it or not, there's a lot of poor Jews, especially once the former Soviet Union opened up. There were millions, and there are many still there because they can't all leave. And I've gone there many times. If you're interested, please let me know of knowing more. But I really have to say that the work my father did it through the Joint and the work I'm doing is very rewarding in not only helping people who need help in their communities, but in people who need to suddenly leave, such as out of Venezuela or out of the Arab countries. My first exposure was seeing people in a transit camp when I was 12. My father took me many, many years ago to see people who didn't use water for washing, just drinking, because they lived in the Atlas Mountains and were rushing off to Israel. So this is the great work that's done. And my grandfather, the thing I most admired about my grandfather, which my father had too, no pretensions. No pretensions. I think my children wish I had a few more pretensions. And sorry. And so, for example, he was very keen on saving money because, you know, to run a place like Sears, you really had to watch every light bulb or every postage stamp. So he wrote to his, I think it's in the movie, he wrote to his son, how could you spend 6 cents on mandolin strings when you can get them for 2 cents at Sears catalog, and so forth. And my aunt wrote him a telegram. She wrote, when she was away, she was a grown-up, she said, a young adult, she wrote, roses are red, violets are blue, please send me 100 PDQ. I don't know if you know that pretty darn quick. Do we remember what PDQ means? And he wrote back a telegram, very typical of him, although remember, I never met him. He died 11 years before I was born. My grandfather did. But my grandfather wrote my aunt, roses are red, carnations pink, I'll send you the 100, I don't think. And that was exactly the way he was. He was funny, he was straightforward, he was unpretentious. And I think that the point of Aviva's film is that we all can be Rosenwalds in our life. And through the Joint, I'm trying to do some work. It's nothing compared to the genius of my father, who could see what was going on. He was also very funny when he was a $1 a year man during World War I, and he met so many generals. And at one big gathering, they said, well, I'm General so-and-so and General so-and-so. And they said, what is your name? And he said, I'm General Merchandise. Which just shows that he was a good person. You'll see how funny he is because there's a wonderful film, AVIVA. I want to give a shout out to AVIVA, who spent numerous years making this movie, and she was relentless in finding so much material, films and pictures and people, and that seeing him say that people should not think that rich people are smart when there's so much evidence to the contrary. So you can imagine I'm very proud to be a member of the family, a little bit daunted, but very proud. And now I'd like to turn over to Carol Boston. I'm sorry.
Weatherford.
Yes, I'm sorry. Carol Boston Weatherford, handwriting. Carol Boston Weatherford, who wrote a book that actually I got a copy of years ago. I absolutely love it. And I will let her tell you about it, but it's exquisite. And if you're smart, you will go and order one right now because it's being made available. Is that right, Olivia?
Yes, everyone will get an email after today's program. So if you haven't had a chance yet to order Carol's book, you will have that chance this afternoon. And sales will continue until Wednesday at 10 p.m. So that's—
Carol, I have one question for you before you start. How did you come up with the idea to write this book?
That's an interesting story. I have a family history in education and also in rural areas. So I'll make some of those connections for you in the presentation. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you, Elizabeth, for your family. Thank you, AVIVA, for documenting this this bit of history that was in danger of slipping into obscurity. And thank you, Olivia Mattis and the Sousa Mendez Foundation for bringing this to light for a new audience. So, I mine the past for family stories, fading traditions, and forgotten struggles. My work is often a hybrid of poetry, biography, nonfiction, and historical fiction. Of my 50-plus books, Moses, When Harriet Tubman Led Her People to Freedom, is the most famous. That book parallels the journey of Harriet Tubman on the Underground Railroad and against slavery to the book of Exodus in the Bible, and parallels the journey of African-American enslaved people with that of the Jewish enslaved people in ancient Egypt. Like Tubman, my father's family has roots on Maryland's Eastern Shore. My father's maternal great-grandfathers, pictured here, were both enslaved at Wye House Plantation, Maryland's largest slaveholding plantation. For 2 years, Wye House was also home to Frederick Douglass, who now is considered the plantation's most famous resident. After emancipation, my great-great-grandfathers co-founded the all-Black villages of Copperville and Unionville, not far from the plantation where they had been enslaved. The co-founders of those villages must have valued education because both villages had one-room schools. My father, pictured in the center, attended the one-room school at your right. That was the Copperville School. The school went up to grade 8, and after that, African Americans had to pay for a high school education in that county or go to Baltimore to get free public education. My father didn't have to go very far to get to school because his grandfather's farm, his grandfather's pictured on your left, that farm was just right across the street from the one-room school. My great aunt, Marie, was the teacher there. She came down from New Jersey after getting her teacher training. And my great uncle Bill got sweet on her, as they might have said back in the 1920s, and they wound up getting married. My mother taught at segregated schools in Virginia and later in Maryland. I'm not sure if any of those schools were Rosenwald schools, but I don't think they were. She taught, my mother's school was Central High School, an all-Black school in Big Stone Gap in Appalachia. And she went on to teach at the Harriet Tubman School in Baltimore, in Howard County. My mother recalled that she started each school year by having her students erase marks that had been left in hand-me-down textbooks that had been discarded by the white schools. So that was the first day of school. activity. I first heard of Rosenwald schools after moving to North Carolina, the state I now call home. My mother-in-law attended 2 of the 6 Rosenwald schools in Caswell County. So she probably attended one of these 4 schools. When my book, Dear Mr. Rosenwald, debuted in 2006, there were no children's books on the subject. I always like to be the first one to write about a topic when I can. The book includes a series of poems narrated by 8-year-old Ovella. The poems chronicle the building of a Rosenwald school in a rural sharecropping community, which I envisioned as set in North Carolina. Rosenwald schools, as you know, were a symbol of hope, pride, of how much the communities valued education, of community itself, and of the teamwork that it took to make these schools happen, not just teamwork between the Rosenwald Foundation and the communities, but teamwork within the communities, between the whites in the community and among the African Americans in the community. So the schools were very important and played a vital role in the communities where they were built. So I'm going to read 3 poems from the book, which is illustrated by Gregory Christie. I've chosen a poem from the beginning, one from the middle, and one from near the end. This is entitled One Room School. My teacher, Miss Mays, said, "You can't judge a school by the building. When the roof leaks, she calls us vessels of learning. When the floor creaks, she says knowledge is a solid foundation. Wind whistles through walls, blowing the sheet that splits the church into 2 classrooms. Me on one side, Junior on the other. Till I passed 3rd grade, I sat beside him, counting on my fingers and fidgeting on the pew. Now I know better. My school is not much to speak of, but Mama says I'm lucky, even if class don't meet during harvest. Down here," she said, "some Black children go to school in shacks, corn cribs, or not at all. Don't know what I'd do if I couldn't go to school. Harvest break, just when I memorize the timetables. Instead of learning long division, I'll be working in the field." Passing the plate. This is actually one of my favorite poems in the collection. Homecoming Sunday, a church full. Uncle Bo didn't need to preach a sermon after going on about the new school. Said we're gathering money, a nickel and dime at a time. The ushers passed the plate. Afterward, Uncle Bo waved envelopes white neighbors sent, $20 in all. Then the choir sang, "The Lord will make a way somehow." Just before the service ended, Miss Etta May asked to have a word. I was born a slave, worked hard even after freedom came. Never had time for book learning. Here's $1 from money I've been saving for my burial. Hurry and build that school so I can learn to read my Bible. And the last poem is entitled 1922 White Oak School. Uncle Bo cut the ribbon at the doorway, and we marched into the new school, proud as can be. The place sparkled. After we sang Lift Every Voice, Professor James told us to be proud. Learning is priceless, he said. He gave Miss Mays a framed picture of Mr. Rosenwald for the lobby. Uncle Bo called Miss Shaw up front, a pretty new teacher from the city. No more 8 grades in one room. Miss Shaw has a sing-song voice. Children, you are diamonds in the rough. I will polish you bright as stars. I had to speak next. Clammy hands, knees shaking, heart in my throat. Thank you, parents and neighbors, for building this brand new school. Your sweat taught us a lesson. Tomorrow is in our hands. And so that is an excerpt from Dear Mr. Rosenwald.
Carol, can I ask you a question? You know, the most schools were built in North Carolina. Do you have it's something I've always meant to explore. Do you have any idea? Was it just a more somewhat progressive school system? I just don't know why. Maybe there's just
You know, I don't know. There could be there are two possible reasons, maybe even three. But the two, one of them is is what you offered. Another is that could be that that there were fewer schools in North Carolina to begin with. Thus, the need was greater in North Carolina. I don't know, which explanation I would prefer. Or, perhaps there was more money raised. Maybe the people in North Carolina were more enthusiastic about raising matching funds or providing the sweat equity. So I don't know, but I've wondered the same thing.
Yeah, I've recently heard that there's a new film about the North Carolina schools, so maybe that film will have the answer.
I hope so.
So I would like to encourage people to start putting even more questions into the chat window. I see that there are already some questions. Right now, I would like to just say a word or two about our upcoming programs, and then we're going to open it up to discussion and Q&A. So this week's program and next week's program are kind of a pair. They both feature Jewish heroes of African American history. So today we're talking about a hero who died before World War II. He died in 1932. Next week, we're focusing on Joachim Prinz, who was one of the heroes of the Civil Rights Movement, and he spoke in the 1963 March on Washington. He was a rabbi in Berlin during World War II, during the rise of Hitler. And when he came to America in 1937, he saw parallels between what he had seen in Germany and what was going on here with the struggle for civil rights, and he vowed not to be silent. So I'd like to ask Matthew to please play a little clip.
I speak to you as an American Jew. I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime. I learned many things.
I met Rabbi Prinz, was about 1933. He was, to us, what nowadays would be a rock star.
At one service, he held up a copy of the Nazi newspaper Der Stürmer. He held it up and he said, "Is this what we really look like? Look at yourselves and look at each other. Is this the true picture of the Jews?"
Now, he was arrested, I think, 3 or 4 or 5 times. And he was released and allowed to preach, begging the Jews to leave Germany.
I've met many people in Israel who say they would not be free. They wouldn't be alive were it not for Rabbi Prinz.
His attitude was the purpose of a synagogue is to break down the walls of the sanctuary and to take the value system of this ancient tradition into the streets.
The most important thing that I learned in my life is that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence.
And now let's take it back to today's program and start addressing some of the questions that have been accumulating in the chat window. So Rhonda Freeman asks, how many of the schools have been restored so far and how many are planned for restoration? Can one of you take that question?
Elizabeth, I think it's about 100.
100 restored, but there are about 400 left.
Right.
About 100 left, and there's about 100 and some odd that have been restored. I visited North Carolina in Wilmington County, North Carolina, and they have a beautiful, in Pender County, they have in one trip I visited 8 schools, and they're anything from community centers to
museums,
citizen centers, places where they can demonstrate about prejudice, and they're very well used, and they've been very supported by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. It made them a focus of one entire year, and have continued up that focus.
I'll tell you a funny story. I went to the Righteous Persons Foundation, which is Steven Spielberg's foundation. He started after Schindler's List, and I asked them for some funding for this, and they called me and they said, okay, you're going to get funding, but we're so excited about the schools. Where do we support that? And actually, if you want to know about the schools, you can go to the National Trust for Historical Preservation. And there's a lot of places you can visit, the restored schools.
Yeah, the National Trust declared the schools to be endangered structures several years ago, and I think that launched, or at least that brought more light to the initiative to preserve the existing structures.
Carol, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I met several people who are actually restoring their local schools, often people of color, sometimes not, and they were personally involved and having trouble just, with the government and the regulations and so forth. And one woman said to me, well, I moved the school because the people didn't want it on their land. I'm like, how do you move a school? I just couldn't figure it out. But there's a real dedication. And my grandfather, when he built the schools, did not want people to receive charity. And any of you who saw the film see that Blacks actually contributed a significant portion, which was extraordinary at that time, of the funding for these schools through bake sales, through whatever they could do, giving $1 each or a few pennies each. And it was a matching gift, and they were expected to give. So I think he said, I want them to be able to complain.
And it was also an example of green architecture. It was designed by the architects at Robert Taylor, who was actually Valerie Jarrett's great-great-grandfather at Tuskegee. And there were great examples in terms of where the windows laid and how big they were in terms of having the sun come in. So they're actually be studied now. And I love talking in architecture classes about, how they were able to utilize the design to benefit the students.
Yeah, nowadays we would call that off the grid.
Off the grid, okay.
They were totally off the grid.
Right.
Here's a question for you from Liz Page. Are your poems based on interviews with those who went to the schools or on historical documents?
Both. Primarily, they're based on historical documents. However, I was what's known as the first lady. That meant you were our preacher's wife. And my then husband preached at country churches, and so we pastored in a rural community. So I encountered people, older people at that time who had attended Rosenwald schools. And I was talking with them, as is often the case with my books. I was doing the research before I even knew I was going to write the book. So I encountered these people, and then when I found out the history and the man behind the schools and the plan behind the schools, everything kind of came together for me.
So Aviva, here's a question for you from Phyllis Ostrega. How widely distributed is your film, and has it been shown on PBS?
The good news and the bad news. The good news, it's been in commercial release a couple years back. And now it's had a big non-theatrical. And I also got a grant from the Kellogg Foundation to take it to different places. Actually, I'm going to be in New York later this week. I'm going to be in Louisiana. It's virtual, obviously, with speakers. And now I still have to raise a little bit more money to pay for the rights, because when I got the original rights, it was for festivals, but it wasn't for TV and streaming. So now I'm looking into how to get it on TV. Good
And
question.
also for you, Aviva, Liz Page wants to know, how do we purchase the extended film version?
Right. All you have to do is go to rosenwaldfilm.org and you can order the DVD. And there's also t-shirts, but you can get the DVD, and on that same DVD is a disc with 4.5 hours of bonus features. And there's also a study guide that you can download for free.
Elizabeth, someone wants to know where your grandfather is buried and whether his headstone mentions anything about his achievements.
Well, my grandfather is buried in Chicago, which is where he lived. He was born in Springfield, catty corner to Lincoln, which inspired him very much. But he was buried in Chicago where he lived. And that's a good question. I don't know. There was a beautiful, in Chicago, there's the Merchandise Mart has a statue of him, and also a stone on the floor. And there's quite, when I was young, I never heard anything except in the family about him. When he came to attention was when Bill Gates made so incredibly much money at Microsoft, and people said he should have a foundation. And there was a big discussion in the papers about the Rosenwald having a sunset foundation. And the idea is there that if you believe each generation should help its own, then you can give a lot more money if it's going out of business than if you portion, 2% or 5% or whatever it is every year. And so there was a big discussion about that. And I think Bill Gates really embraced foundations. But since then, there has been a lot. And I don't know about what it says on his tombstone, but I'm going to find out, and I'll let you know if you give me your address.
Well, may I suggest something? Oh, go ahead, Aviva.
I was just saying there's a movement now to to name a park after him.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And as a poet and as a supporter of the Black Lives Matter movement, I would suggest putting ally on his tombstone.
I like that.
He was truly an ally at a time when it could have been dangerous.
Well, people talk a lot about my grandfather, but I don't think anybody can appreciate the role of Black people who encouraged him. Both Madam C.J. Walker was working on some of the things with him, and also, of course, Booker T. Washington, who was such an inspiration. And he went out of favor because he wasn't. He had certain ideas that became out of fashion. I'm not commenting on that, but he really caused these schools. My grandfather didn't have the idea. It was Booker T. Washington's idea, an execution. So I think there's a lot. My grandfather did not like his name on anything. His name was on the Museum of Science and Industry, and he made them take it off. He said, how can I raise money for it? People say it's his museum, let him pay for it. And he said, this is not mine. The only thing I know that his name is on is a college at the University of Chicago. And I don't know why he let that happen. Maybe he was embarrassed not to, but he just hated to have his name. And my father continued that, did not want his name on anything.
But the Michigan Garden Apartments have been totally restored, and they're now called the Rosenwald Court, which is privately owned, but it's just a beautiful restoration. And when you walk in, there's a poster of the film, so it's really great.
I think informally, the Museum of Science and Industry was called for years the Rosenwald Museum, but he would not have that. And so I think that, I don't think he was as concerned. I will tell you a funny story. When he was dying, and he was so in love with these schools, it meant so much to him. He was so proud of what he had been able to accomplish, and he loved going and hearing the spirituals. And one day, my father rushed to his bedside because he was really not doing well at all for his heart. And he said, I was so ill. He said, I thought I was going to wake up this morning and say, good morning, Jesus. And he just loved that. He understood what was going on.
So there's been quite a bit of discussion in the chat window about your grandfather's grave, and somebody found a picture of it.
Oh,
put it in the
wonderful.
Chat. So there's a question from Barbara Nadell, which is, how did JR meet Booker T. Washington?
Well, he first read the book, and then he reached out to him and invited him to come up to Chicago, which was a big thing because the hotel that the event was at, he invited him to a luncheon. An African-American had not come in. I mean, you know, we have the segregated North too. So it was the book that inspired Booker T. Washington's book, Up From Slavery, that was handed to him by a fellow businessman. Do you remember the businessman's name?
I do.
He also handed him another book that
I'll look it up. I'll look it up. Yeah, I have it. Yes, I have it. And then, yes, sorry.
Peter Oscar.
Baldwin. William Baldwin.
Sorry. Got too many new films in my head. Can I just make a point? Elizabeth talked about you could read it in the newspaper, but it's really apropos to your foundation's, Olivia's role. In 1941, there was a very small article, very hidden in the New York Times, saying that 2 million Jews had died. So people knew, but it wasn't like a front page story. And then there was a group of Orthodox rabbis that came and demonstrated. And then there's a whole story about, you know, did the Jewish community do enough? And that's, you know, my new film on Ben Hecht with a group of Palestinians, Jews from Palestine, Peter Bergson being one of them. They try to make a big stink about it, but it's just amazing to me. This would never happen today. How so few, if they knew about it, were working quietly, and it was a very anti-Semitic State Department, and it's just not doing enough. And thank God that just does not happen in today's world.
Well, we have a similar problem now. I think people will agree with too much news. And so then Black Lives Matter, and then people go and forget about Black Lives Mattering, and it's too bad because they should remember. So,
and a lot of fake news.
And a lot of fake news.
So, I mean, it's extremely hard. I teach at a university, and it's extremely hard for young people to decipher, you know, what the real news is.
Older people.
And also just beyond the news, to figure out, well, what information is really important. There's such a glut of information that everything's coming at them, and they can't decide not only what's true, but what should be prioritized.
Aviva, can you please repeat the name of the website where folks can buy the DVD? Because there's a question about that.
I'm pretty sure it's rosenwaldfilm.org.
Thank you.
But I can look it up.
Now, where did the teachers come from in the Rosenwald?
A film that needs to be done. Do you want to talk about that, Carol?
You probably know more about it than I do, but I do know that in some cases the states had to hire them, and in other cases the schools themselves, the communities themselves had to identify the teacher, pay for the teacher, and put the teacher up as well.
There was a Quaker woman with the last name of Jeans, and she paid for these young African-American women to go south. I wish someone would make a documentary, but also a feature film. These women were just incredible. And actually, not only were the schools built, but some of the housing for these teachers. So oftentimes that's how the schools were, who were the teachers. And you know, the way they taught, there were one room or one school for a lot of grades. It was almost like a Montessori thing happening, because the younger would hear what the older were learning. So there was a lot of up and down in terms of people learning, education. I'm trying to.
You have to understand the commitment that it took for somebody who's a sharecropper to let their kids not work, but go to school. There was a tremendous pressure for the kids to be on the field and working. And people have written about that. By the way, Jeans is spelled Jeanes, I believe. And so if you're looking it up, you can look it up in Google, Jeans Teachers, Jeanes. And it's extraordinary, but that's an excellent question. And the teachers didn't necessarily have ideal conditions, but they had I read so much about the commitment they had. And how many people told me my mother was a Jeans teacher, was not a Jeans teacher, but my mother was a teacher in a Rosenwald school. And I've met some people who were actually Jeans teachers. Rosenwald school teachers. I think the main takeaway from all of this is that we can make a difference, and you don't have to be a multimillionaire to make a difference. We got a note, Olivia passed to me a note by Jill Slansky. I think she might be on this call. And I was so moved by it because she's a retired teacher and supports a fellowship, I believe, for teachers each year. And I mean, it's just, you can all make something and we can all reach out to somebody. And it doesn't mean you have to give up on your family to reach out to others. You can do both. And it's just as meaningful, or perhaps a little more meaningful, because when you're very wealthy, you don't have to change your lifestyle to give away money. But I've seen many gifts by people who did change their lifestyle in order to help others. So I think it's beautiful that all of you are interested in the Sousa Mendes Foundation and the work that Mr. Sousa Mendes did that was so extraordinary. And if you want to know more about American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, you can look it up that way. If you write the JDC, you can find it, but it's a little harder, or the joint is a little harder.
So I would like to know from both Carol and from Aviva, what's next for each of you? Carol, what's next for you?
My next book will be Unspeakable, the Tulsa Race Massacre, set in 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's illustrated by Floyd Cooper and will be out in February.
Wow.
And a good friend of mine is casting the feature film on it.
Okay.
I know.
Talk about your recent film, Aviva.
Oh, so I'm doing the film on Ben Hecht, and also I'm co-directing with a Cheyenne filmmaker a movie called Imagining the Indian about Native American mascotting. You know, this was a big issue here with the Washington football team, but there's over 2,000 schools now, as well as 5 professional teams that have very demeaning names to Native Americans, and really affects the psychology of young Native Americans who, as it is, are facing poverty and suicide and now COVID. So many years before I became a filmmaker, I did Native American issues, both in Vista and law school. So it's something close to my heart. And the Ben Hecht film. And then I have a short I'm doing called Pissed Off, about how women fought for potty parity in Congress. So there used to be no bathrooms for women off the Senate. And you know, now we have increasing numbers, probably also in 10 days, even more so, of women on both the House and the Senate side. So I'm keeping busy.
So there is a question about how to order Carol's book. So there are still signed and inscribed copies of the book available for purchase up until Wednesday evening at 10 p.m. And this afternoon, you will be getting an email with instructions. It's going to take you to a brand new link, which is also on Eventbrite, and it's going to have you buy a ticket, but really the ticket is to buy the book. So you press ticket, but it's a book purchase. And please don't forget to tell us where to send the book. So we need the name and the address where to send it, and the inscription as you would like it to read. So now I would like to turn back to our 3 speakers for some final thoughts. It's 4:53 here on the East Coast. So Aviva, I'm wondering what kind of, let's start with Carol. Carol, what kind of final thoughts would you like to leave with our audience today?
I'd like to say that education can still be an equalizer, but we're only going to get as much out of it as we put in. And ultimately, certainly, it's up to government to provide the funding, but it's up to communities to be involved in the schools that our children attend. So I think that is a powerful legacy from the Rosenwald Fund.
Wow.
Elizabeth, what would you like?
Who can follow that? Who can follow that? That's it. What she said. I think that's so beautiful.
Well, maybe Elizabeth, you can tell us a little bit about what's next for you. What are you working on now?
Right now, I'm trying to, I'm working a great deal with the JDC right now. Actually, it's taking an incredible amount of time, which I wish it wouldn't, but it's really, it's one thing to give money for food And it's another thing to make sure the food gets there. And we have a situation now with COVID where you have tens of thousands of people, elderly, very elderly, who have to choose between food and medicine. And you have to, so the joint ended up giving them cell phones because it was impossible to reach them. And they were paying people special money to, with the help of the claims conference, to get there. And so it's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done there. It's so much easier to give to a hospital where your name will be up and all the people in your country club, which I don't belong to, will see what you gave to, but to give to somebody far away or somebody who's so different from you, whom you don't know. So I think that for me, giving to people that I've never met or that meet when I go over there next time if I travel means more to me. But that's probably also because of my mother, who was a refugee.
And another question for you, Elizabeth, before we turn to Aviva, and that has to do in general with your family legacy, and maybe you can encapsulate what it means to you.
Oi, that's what it means to me. It's a little heavy, you know. I look at my grandfather, who was a total genius. I mean, the things he thought up, if you see the movie, you'll be surprised, and how he inspired others and got others to work. And my father, who taught me a lot, I actually worked with him. I was a painter, and then I didn't want to be a painter, and he wanted me to come into his business, so I did, which was investments and finance, but also the philanthropy. And I think that he was brilliant in his own way and saw what other people couldn't see and had the energy. I think Aviva has more energy than almost anybody I've ever met, but he had a tremendous amount of energy for it. And when he would ask somebody for money, and they'd say, well, I don't have any money this year. And then he'd say, you yourself explain why you should give money. And I thought the guy was going to haul off and smack him, but no, my father had such credibility. I think I had to do things my own way and be a different person, and not for want of resources, for want, which of course, who has those resources, but also for want of being that person. And I think each of us has to find our own way how to live.
Aviva, the last word goes to you today.
The one thing I forgot to say is, you know, my foundation, the Czesław Foundation, which is named after my grandparents because they perished in Auschwitz. You might have to go to CIESLA to get the DVD, because I'm not sure Rosenwald Film has the DVD for sale, because I was only looking at my iPad, but you can get the downloadable study guide for free. And the other thing that's very dear to my heart is the first film I made called Partisans of Vilna, which is about Jews fighting the Nazis. And we're going back to that because of the Claims Commission. I have to raise some matching funds, but most importantly, to get digital versions of all the interviews in every Holocaust archives, because this is a story that we were able to, because I had the idea in '79 to get like the interviews of those people who resist the first call for resistance. And, you know, even, you know, the importance of Holocaust education to us is so important. And then the line I always use is, we may not all have $68 million to give away like JR did, but I think you need to channel the JR in yourself.
Great.
And I admire the work the foundation does. It's very important.
Great. Well, what a story you've brought to us today. My goodness. So I do encourage anyone who would like to order Carol's book to do so between now and Wednesday evening, and to order Aviva's film from her website. And of course, I thank our three fabulous speakers, and I thank all of you for spending some of your Sunday with us. Please join us again next week for our next program, and have a nice rest of your day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Stay safe. Wear a mask.
Yes, absolutely.
Goodbye.